Thank you, Eduarda, also for the introduction. It's good to follow on from Jens. He raised a lot of interesting questions, but I'm not going to respond to them. I'll focus on my brief, Eduarda, just in case you get worried.
Yeah.
Yes. So what we're going to talk about today, colleagues, is the curriculum mapping study that is underway. The survey has been completed, but the results are not public yet. So Zaahedah, myself, and Carmen, who's on the call, are busy with the analysis. But what we can share with you is just some of the preliminary results. And it's quite interesting. We were hoping for a very good response rate. The last time we did a survey in Africa, we got, I think, Eduardo, it was an 80% response. This time it was a little bit lower. It was more like in the 26 countries, 30% response, but it's not bad. And it's enough data for us to work with. So bear with me, colleagues. We're going to try and do this a little bit interactive. So Zaahedah is going to put a link for you in the chat. And so the slides will be delivered via Mentimeter. In between the slides, we're going to do a quick exercise with you. So if any of you are multitasking or you're doing something else, we need you to come back now, and we're going to do some exercise with you as well. So just bear with us as we go through the presentation. If you're with me on the presentation, there's a little thumbs up on your screen that you can push, and then we'll see it on our slides as well. But I'm not going to wait for you. I will ask you to join again as we go along in the slideshow. So firstly, let me locate the study in the broader context of what we're talking about today. Eduardo has covered most of this, so I'm just going to remind you. There are a lot of activities happening around the ACQF. The curriculum mapping study that we're talking to you about today is in the bottom right-hand corner, and it's around the technical foundations of the work that is underway at the moment. There are also things like guidelines that Eduardo spoke about a few minutes ago, but in particular, we're going to talk about the curriculum study. The key outputs that you'll see coming through in the coming weeks and months would be a comprehensive report, a shorter synthesis version, and as well as some engagements with you via webinars. But I think what is important about today is you can see there's a holistic approach. We are not doing things in an ad hoc way. We are trying to follow a very clear logic in the different components of the ACQF work that is underway. I think it's now in its second year, Eduardo, and we've still got a few years to go. So if I move on, the research design is important for you, and I'm briefly going to give Gertrude an opportunity to come in and explain the research design to you. I just want to check if Gertrude is on the call, Eduardo. I didn't see her just now. Maybe we can just give her a chance.
Yeah, because of the connectivity issues.
If she's not, I'm happy to continue.
Gertrude is, I also don't see her. So maybe we go on, and then we will have Gertrude's comments, for example, later in the presentation, so that a little bit the pace. Thank you.
Okay, just let me know if she's back, and then we'll stop for a second. Okay, so colleagues, what did we try and do? We're trying to map the school curricula, but there we include both TVET and schooling curricula. We had a little bit of a look at ECCD, or early childhood development, but only to some extent. Our main focus was on the schooling and on the TVET curriculum. We did consider very carefully the link to national qualifications frameworks, and I'm going to show you a picture in the following slide about how we can potentially consider qualifications and curricula and how they relate to each other, as well as credentials, and as well as digital credentials that Jens spoke about a few minutes ago. What's really important about the study and what we're doing, again, I mean, the mapping study is self-reported data. So we've got to be careful with the data. The data has to be interpreted carefully and triangulated. But what it does do, it gives us a sense of the state of play. So it's not exact, but it does help us to understand where we are as countries in Africa when it comes to curriculum. So kind of 5 key areas that we looked at around the objectives is identify the different conceptual frameworks. What underpins the curriculum in your country? The second one, what was the most important features, particularly as we think about broader African Union initiatives and how do our countries relate to these initiatives? The third component was around NQF principles and descriptors. I've mentioned that before. The fourth component was a link to the SDGs, but there I would also include CESA and the CESA indicators, so more broadly, the umbrella indicators that apply to our countries, both internationally and continentally. And then lastly, how can this work inform curriculum development going forward in our different countries? So let me go to the next slide. So this is what we've done so far, and we're not quite finished yet. So the mapping exercise is taking stock and updating evidence. giving us a state of play in our countries. What was the methodology? We did a couple of key informant interviews. And I think the most important part was the survey, the third part, but it was supported by a desktop review. You can see our responses. We got 26 responses from 16 countries. So that's just under 30%. It's not bad. Being an overachiever, I like 80%, but 30% is nearly there. And it's good enough for us to work with as we talk today. So what are the kind of why questions that we're trying to answer? I've gone through them in the previous slide, but maybe just to remind you, the frameworks, what are the knowledge and skills that are being captured in our curricula? What are the mega trends that our countries are following? How does it align to qualification frameworks and also the foundational disciplines? Very important focus. We all know that in our schooling systems and our TVET systems, language and numeracy are really important, particularly in the early years. So let me go on one slide. And this one I just want to spend a few minutes on. This is a conceptual framework that underpins our work on curriculum, but also on qualifications. And it looks like a busy slide, and we are leaving the slide with you, so I'm not going to be able to talk to it for a long time today. But effectively, what we try and show you in the slide is if you start right at the bottom, we say learning outcomes is an important currency that is being used not only in Africa, but also internationally. Learning outcomes can describe a qualification, it can describe a curriculum, and it can describe a learning program. In many of our countries, not only in Africa, but internationally, we tend to use these terms interchangeably. And so learning programs and curriculum and qualifications are often quite confusing for many of our countries in the way they get used. And I think it's important that we clarify this and gradually, as a continent, also move towards clarity around these terminologies. What is important is learning outcomes is used to describe knowledge, skills, and competencies. In some cases, people might use attitudes or values or different attributes. But broadly, there are different domains that these learning outcomes are used in. Many people refer to them as head, heart, and hands. So our countries would differ in the way that we group these learning outcomes together. But broadly, these three domains are applied in many of our countries. The thing that we want to do as countries is we want to recognize these knowledge, skills, and attitudes or competencies. How do we recognize them? Through forms of assessment that are mostly linked to curriculum. The assessment leads to certification. The more modern words that are being used are badging, but I completely agree with Jens and some of the speakers on the chat. Maybe it's just old things that we're giving new names to. But what is important about the new names is they signal that we are more agile and that we are more digital in the work that we do. And I think the COVID pandemic has really helped us to accelerate our thinking around digital technology. What we see increasingly happening in the international domain as well is we're talking about credentials and not only qualifications. And two types of credentials, micro, which are smaller, and macro, which are probably more aligned to longer qualifications that span many years. The really important point for today in the curriculum mapping study is that a learning program, a curriculum, and a qualification is not the same thing. A curriculum often contains a lot more detail. It contains aspects of assessment, of textbooks, of tuition, of pedagogy, where a qualification in most of our countries is more of an umbrella term that helps us to understand how to develop a curriculum and a learning program. But we'll come back to these debates. As a continent, I think it's important that we don't have a one-size-fits-all. And most of us will have different views on the terms that I'm showing you today. But we've got to start somewhere. And so this somewhere that we're starting is this diagram that I'm showing you today. Let me move on. So some of the initial findings from the mapping study, and the first set of findings we're going to show you is from some of the international comparisons. So what I'm going to do now, and I'm going to pause for a moment because I need you to do an exercise with me. There are 9, I suppose, regional and international assessments that came through in the curriculum mapping study. And I want you to take a bit of time, and I'm really going to give you time to join me, is of these 9, which are you the most familiar with? So you can use the link in the chat that Zaadeh's put for you, or, and I'm briefly going to just show you how to come to me and do this with me, is you can follow this using your cell phone. If your cell phone has got a QR code capacity, you just open your camera and you hold it over the QR code. If you've got an iPhone, it will automatically take you to where I am. If you've got an Android phone, you just need perhaps an app. It depends on what phone you're using. If you don't want to use your cell phone, you can just go to this URL, menti.com, and the code that I'm reading now for you is going to be at the top of my screen as well. 017976. So I'm going to go back to my screen. And the question is that you should be seeing on your screen as well. How widely are the following regional and international, sorry for the typo, and international assessments used in Africa? And I really want a couple of people more to join me. So we're about 60 people on the call, and 2 people are too few. So colleagues, I need you to come to me. If you're doing something else, I need you to come back, and I need you to do this exercise with me. I'm going to give you a little bit of time. If anybody's stuck, you can also use the link in the chat. It'll take you straight to this exercise that we're doing. Please don't answer in the chat, but try and answer on this, this polling tool that we're using with you. And thank you. I see more people are joining slowly. I'm just going to be a little bit patient, Eduardo. I'm sorry if I'm going to take too much time, but I think it's important.
Yes.
PISA, of course, is a very familiar international assessment. I would expect it to come out high today. There's also an assessment called PISA for schools, which is something that some of our African countries I know. I think Kenya, in particular, and Uganda, is using PISA for schools, but many of our countries across Africa use PISA. SACMEC is a regional assessment that SADC countries, so the 15 countries in SADC, would be more familiar with, perhaps not other countries in Africa. TIMS is also quite a familiar international assessment that focuses on mathematics and science. PILS, I would also expect to come out a little bit higher. But it's interesting. I see more people are joining us, so thank you for that. I'm going to be a little bit patient. I need at least 20 people before I move on, colleagues. The question I would ask you, I'm using acronyms here, and some of you are going to ask me, like, what does this acronym stand for? So give me a second. I'm going to explain the acronyms to you in the next slide. If you're not familiar with them, then of course they are not used in your region in any case. When we asked this question in the survey, it was very clear that there's a huge disparity on how these international assessments are used across our countries. Okay, we're on 14. It's not too bad. I'm going to move on, but there's going to be another exercise. So if you haven't joined us, please, in the next one, please join us. So here's some of the findings. On the left-hand axis, you can see exactly the same assessments that I just showed you on the Mentimeter. And this is the responses we got. You can see in the right-hand corner, I've given you the acronyms. So if you're not sure about them, you can read them there, and you can also download the slides. What you can see is that the PASIC assessment is definitely used quite widely, or more familiar on our continent. You can see that PISA, SACMEC, and TIMS are probably the ones that are the most familiar to our continent. The question we probably need to ask ourselves as a continental group is, how do we develop assessments that are fit for purpose for our own continent? And how do we think about curriculum when it comes to these international assessments? So this was a self-reported exercise about how many of our countries are actually participating in these international and regional assessments. Very few of them are actually from Africa, although some are. And so the question really is, when we think about curriculum, how do we think about international assessments and how do they relate to what we do around curriculum? Let me go to the next slide. So this is now your reported performance of your national education system against these standards that I've just shown you. So you can see we've got categories here. The shading will show you. So the light blue is early grade. The purple is particularly, well, the light blue is early grade literacy. The purple is early grade numeracy and mathematics. The blue is secondary level, and then the dark purple is secondary level performance in particular, and the orangey color is TVET. It's interesting to see that when we ask ourselves a question on how do we achieve against these international standards, we mostly think we're in the medium category, probably across all these different characteristics. Many of us think we do quite well, but equally, many of us are not sure. So I think one of the things we see coming through just in these early findings on the curriculum mapping study is a huge variety around the application of these international assessments. The key thing that I would leave with you is this is self-reported. So we've got to triangulate this data with our actual achievement against these international assessments. Let me move on. So the next question we asked was around ISCET. So ISCET is the International Standard Classification of Education. It's used quite widely by UNESCO, and particularly by the UNESCO Institute of Statistics when they gather data from countries across the world, but of course countries in Africa as well. So the question we asked here was, what is the ISCET level of the minimum qualifications required to teach in your country? Now, there are a couple of interesting things coming through from this figure. Firstly, it's quite alarming that some countries are reporting that ISCET level 2 is acceptable to teach. This is very low. And so it would be a red flag for most of us in our countries that how can somebody with an ISCET 2 be allowed to teach in our countries? But this is a debate we need to have as a continent as well. The other thing that's coming through very strongly on these findings would be the bar on the right-hand side. Many of us reported that we're not sure, whether we're in ECCDE or schooling or TVET. So clearly this is another signal to us in terms of the work we're doing in ACQF, that ISCET is also not a familiar terminology in many of our countries. So firstly, we started with those international assessments, and now I'm talking about ISCET. In both these cases, I think there's work for us to do to understand and use these international categorizations and assessments in a more significant way. The next set of questions focus on the curriculum underpinnings, and let me just show you some of these results. But before I do that, I need you to do a quick exercise with me again. So the question is, how widely are learning outcomes used in these three sectors in your country? The three sectors are the well-known sectors: early childhood development, schooling, and TVET. Could you join me, please, and give me a sense in terms of your view, how widely do you think learning outcomes as a construct is used in these three sectors in your country? I'm going to give you a minute or two. You need to go away from the Zoom and go to the actual Mentimeter. You can just use the same link you used just now, or you can use the URL at the top of my screen. And that'll take you straight to this, this small exercise that we're just doing together. Okay, interesting how high TVET is just on the early responses. It's also interesting, I think, over the last 10 to 15 years, how commonplace the use of learning outcomes have become. The category I don't have on here is higher education, of course, because the curriculum mapping study did not cover higher education. I found from what I've worked in African countries, higher education is probably somewhat a little bit slower when it comes to the use of learning outcomes, but let me not generalize because it's not always the case. So what we see from these findings, and I just want to encourage people to participate with me, we see that probably in your view at least, is that TVET is definitely quite high in its use of learning outcomes, as well as schooling, and perhaps the ECCDE sector less so. But let's look at the results. So here's some of the results that are coming through from our mapping study. So firstly, very few at least that say that they don't use learning outcomes at all, which is a good sign, I suppose, in terms of what we're trying to do. We see partial use of learning outcomes across all three sectors, and we see comprehensive use of learning outcomes across all three sectors. And then a couple of respondents that were not sure. I think this confirms the previous exercise we did. Learning outcomes are definitely used quite strongly across our countries, both in curriculum, but also in learning outcomes and in qualifications, if I can refer to my earlier diagram that I used. Let me move on. How about the domains? So when I showed you the picture just now with all the different components on, I used 3 domains. I used knowledge, skills, and competencies. But of course, there are other domains that are used across the world. What we found in our African curriculum mapping study is we found a very strong emphasis on knowledge and skills and competency and attitudes, virtually evenly spread. But we also asked our countries, how many of you would focus on values? And there was a very low response to that. I suppose it's also a debate for us as an ACQF community, whether that's important or not. But I do think the findings show us is quite a common trend towards the use of at least 4 domains: knowledge, skills, competency, and attitudes. And this is helpful for us because if we have an ACQF, we've got to understand that the domains used and how they link to the domains used in our own countries, and how learning outcomes can become this common currency that we use from a country to a region to a continent. Let me move on one, and I'm nearly done. We're moving a little bit slowly. If you could just maybe mute if you've got your mic on. Some of the curriculum themes that we asked countries to respond on, and you can see quite interesting. We asked, does decolonization feature strongly in your curriculum? The response rate was relatively low there. Universal values, quite high. Norms, values, and culture, quite high. But that actually contradicts the previous slide, or somewhat contradicts it, because there we asked you about values and it was very low. We asked you about Ubuntu and Pan-Africanism, and some of these themes do come through in your curriculum. I've just got to stress this is self-reported data, and what we're trying to do here is recognize a state of play. We are not trying to do a super scientific study that is correlated with empirical evidence, but it's a start, and from here we can of course build on the results. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to ask my colleague Zaahedah to present to you, and we're going to do one more short Mentimeter exercise with you. So Zaahedah, over to you.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon, everyone. The next slide, please, James. Okay, so as James said, the survey is really part of a holistic process around the ACQF, and the survey really built on the ACQF. So this particular slide looked at the awareness of AU instruments and how they relate to national policies on teacher qualifications, as you can see, their professionalism, and also CPD. So what is a bit of a concern for us is that there's low awareness on particularly, and you can see there at the bottom, the dark blue is the ACQF. Because I said the survey builds on the ACQF, it was a bit of a surprising revelation for us anyway, that many of our respondents were not aware of the process. So again, like James said, the response rate was low. It was only 29%, so that could be, one of the factors. Maybe people who are aware of it on the continent just didn't complete the survey or whatever the case was, but the low awareness is a bit of a concern for us. The next slide, please, James. Okay, the next few slides will just highlight some new trends. So as you can see here, 21st century skills that are required in the fourth industrial revolution. So things that were reported on highly was active learning, creativity, critical thinking, digital skills. And then the more lower reporting was on artificial intelligence skills. And this could be that, African countries or countries on the continent do not maybe see the relevance of artificial intelligence skills. And for us, that is actually one of the good signs, because it shows that, AI is something that many countries around the world are pursuing and following. But if African countries feel that, they're just not in that spot at the moment, or it doesn't fit within the curricula for the continent, then, we won't be following. And I think that's something that's really good. So again, like James said, the slides will be available. You can explore this in more detail, but things like resilience also is, something that's quite highlighted. And I think in the last I was actually thinking about it today, it's almost 2 years that we within this COVID pandemic. So things like learning to learn, resilience, those are really important skills that we need to, focus on and develop in our curricula and in our countries. Next slide, please, James. Following slide as well. Okay, so here many countries reported, and we spoke about NQF, through the webinar. So it's really promising to see that many countries have developed or have NQFs already. 18 countries reported that they do, only 7 reported that they don't. It could be that the 7 countries are still in the process of developing the NQFs. So it was again really promising to see that many countries have already developed their NQFs. And then in terms of curricula aligning with the qualifications framework, so the highest there was the descriptors of the NQF, and that's where curricula and qualification frameworks really do align. And then in terms of levels and cycles, that was also quite high, where the 2 concepts really come together. Next slide, please, James. Okay, with regards to the COVID-19 response and just how countries responded, whether it was with curriculum delivery, catch up, the next few slides will just take us through that. So again, really promising that between 11 and 12 countries reported both. This was in urban areas as well as rural areas. So the dark green is urban areas. And then what is also really promising and enlightening to see is that the rural areas also managed to cover above 50% of the curriculum and managed to deliver about 50% of the curriculum during the pandemic. So in really trying circumstances, it's something new for all of us that we're also trying to get used to, that at least 50% of the curriculum delivery could take place. So something that, again, we could ask ourselves, what strategies are being put in place for countries to catch up in terms of curriculum delivery, because we do know that that has been severely impacted during these past few months. Next slide, please, James. So there's just a little Menti exercise again. If you can just join with the link that I posted in the chat earlier. It is the most recent message on the chat. And we really just want to see, online education during COVID pandemic, and you'll select whatever option you feel there is most relevant. So online teaching is better than face-to-face tuition. Most of our learners have access to the internet. Online education should only be used in emergency situations, and then hybrid models can also work in Africa. So if you can just join using the code above, it's 67017976, and I see 2 responses so far. Both showing hybrid models can work in Africa, and then online education should only be used in emergency situations. We're seeing more responses come up that say hybrid models can work, both online, both face-to-face, and a mixture of them. James, I'll allow for a bit more time also on this question. I see only 7 responses so far. More people saying that hybrid models would work in Africa. No responses so far for online teaching being better than face-to-face. I think a lot of us are wishing to go back to face-to-face on a full-time basis, so that might be, more and more people saying that hybrid models can work. So a combination of both online and face-to-face. Okay, James, I think we can move on. So just some of the methods to ensure curriculum delivery. And here we can see that using online methods was the most reported. 20 respondents said that that was one of the methods that was used. The next method that was quite highly reported on was materials and support to learners. And that could have been in an online form or, hard copies of materials and resources being given to learners as well. The third highest reported method was guidelines to teachers. So just supporting teachers in ensuring curriculum delivery was one of the really important methods highlighted for countries. So what's really important here also to outline is that using online methods is not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything as we see. We do know on our continent, things like data costs, things like connectivity, ICT infrastructure is still developing and is much needed. So for us to move fully to, just using online methods, as we just saw in the Menti exercise, it really wouldn't be possible at this point. And we need that combination of both online and face-to-face with the necessary support. Next slide, please, James. So some of the catch-up measures that were implemented to ensure that curriculum is covered in full would be an online system. Again, this was the most highly reported against. Additional teaching time. So, bringing either, it could be rotational teaching where teachers are teaching mornings and afternoons just to catch up and ensure that learners do cover the complete curriculum. That was one of the measures as well. And then also reduction of holiday periods. 16 respondents, they reported that vacations would be cut in a bit, and then that would also aid curriculum recovery. Next slide, please, James. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion. And as James said, we are busy with the survey write-up and analysis at the moment. So we do hope to have a draft out by the end of November. Am I correct, James? Yeah, in the next month, yeah. I'm just thinking of the various timelines that we have and project deadlines. So yeah, this is definitely a priority for James and myself. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed that
Thanks, Zaahedah.
presentation. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Zaahedah. So, Eduardo, we're done. Maybe just a last point. My point would be that the COVID-19 pandemic has been a massive impact on our countries when it comes to curriculum, but it's also an opportunity.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity to think about curriculum differently, about learning differently. And so I think we're in a good place as a continent having this discussion today. Thanks, Eduardo.